As promised, for more analysis, senior fellow at the Campaign for America's Future, Richard Eskow, is talking to us from Los Angeles, and policy director at Just Foreign Policy, Robert Naiman, is talking to us from Illinois. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Richard, I want to start with you because you pose this question. Are we better off than Egypt? And the answer seems to be pretty obvious, but you're saying that the reality is that income inequality is actually greater in the United States, and the poverty and employment statistics are pretty similar to that of Egypt. How so? How do we make sense of that?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, it's easy to be too facile about these things. It's still tougher to be very poor in Egypt than it is in the United States, for example. And certainly the political system poses a greater threat right now to its people, and they're showing extraordinary courage. But it is important to understand that the problems that Americans see when they turn on the television and watch Egypt aren't as unusual or foreign as they might think. The poverty rates are very similar. The best, what most widely accepted index or measurement of income inequality shows that we actually have much more, or significantly more, unequal distribution of income and wealth in this country. The life expectancy of an African-American male at birth in this country is actually less than that of an Egyptian, and the infant mortality rate for African-Americans in this country, while it's less than Egypt's, is 2.5 times that of a Caucasian in this country, and Egypt's infant mortality rate is falling much more quickly than that of African-Americans in the United States. So the point of my piece was just to illustrate that some of the problems that are causing the uprising in Egypt are not entirely foreign to the American experience, even if the comparison isn't perfect.
Let's actually look at some of these other statistics that you have put out there. 19.6% of Egyptians and 14.5% of Americans live below the poverty line. 21% of Egyptians are considered near poor, and 40% of Americans will fall below the poverty line at some point in their lives. That was also in your piece. Robert Naiman, you have also an interesting take on this whole situation as well, where you really question why the United States has supported Mubarak for so long. Just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, it comes down to an extremely narrow conception of U.S. interests in the region, as you see playing out in the debate right now with some folks in Washington. Obviously, most Americans, they see the pictures on TV, they empathize with the protesters and the demand for democracy and free and fair elections. But you see a rearguard in Washington saying, you know, oh my God, Mubarak is our guy, we're going to lose our guy, this is going to be terrible for U.S. interests in the region. And, you know, what are these U.S. interests that, well, they're very narrow. For example, trying to maintain the economic blockade on Gaza. This is a policy that the current Egyptian government has pursued, supported by the U.S. Maintaining the split between Fatah and Hamas among the Palestinians. This is a policy that the Egyptian government has pursued, supported by the U.S. These are policies that are likely to fall if there's a democratically elected Egyptian government. In other words, the most extreme policies promoted by the United States.
But Robert, what would that look like if there were a democratically elected government? What if it was the Muslim Brotherhood that came into power? What would the U.S. do then?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's likely, and I think serious analysts don't think it's likely that the Muslim Brotherhood will, quote-unquote, come into power. It's likely that the Muslim Brotherhood will participate in power. Nobody knows exactly what percentage of the vote the Muslim Brotherhood would capture in a free and fair election, because Egypt hasn't had a free and fair election in anyone's memory. And the Muslim Brotherhood is arguably disproportionately strong in the opposition today because of the history of selective repression. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood was suppressed, but others were suppressed more. And it's also the case that the Egyptian regime, the Mubarak regime, used the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat to keep the Americans on side and to keep the Egyptian population on side. You know, it's not me or it's the Muslim Brotherhood. But what we've seen in the streets in the last 7 days in the streets of Egypt is a much more diverse representation of Egyptian society in opposition to the Egyptian government. Secularists and Islamists, Muslims and Christians, students and workers, lawyers, professionals. And that's what you're going to see in a transition government, and that's what you're likely to see in a democratic Egypt is a range of views, including Islamists, but not only Islamists.
And of course, it was the economic conditions that brought many, if not most, of these folks out there. And it's interesting because, you know, if we think back to the financial crisis here, up until the collapse, we were sort of made to think that everything was okay with our banking system. And just a few months ago, we were also reassured that Egypt had a quote-unquote stable outlook. And of course, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, was saying that the government was stable just last week, and then was obviously singing a different tune over the weekend. And it's not just her, but other U.S. officials as well. Here's what I mean. Take a look at this.
Our administration so far has handled this tense situation pretty well.
This is not about taking sides.
What side is the U.S. on, Mubarak or the people in the streets?
Well, there's another choice. It's the Egyptian people.
Let me try it a fourth time. This is not about taking sides.
We are on the side, as we have been for more than 30 years, of a democratic Egypt.
To ask a dictator to implement democratic measure after 30 years in power is an oxymoron.
I would not refer to him as a dictator.
They need to let go of Mubarak. They need to side with the people.
Mubarak has been an ally of ours.
It is a real mistake to believe we can toss aside a long-term ally.
Egypt is an ally and friend of the United States. It's an anchor of stability in the Middle East.
I believe it is vital for President Mubarak to help to transform this moment and to make clear that neither he nor his son will be candidates for re-election or for election in the next elections.
We've also been clear that there must be reform, political, social, and economic reforms that meet the aspirations of the Egyptian people.
Clear aspirations of the Egyptian people and take meaningful steps towards political, economic, and social reforms.
In the absence of these reforms, grievances have built up over time.
It is not up to us to determine when the grievances of the Egyptian people have been met by the Egyptian government.
The United States will continue to stand up for the rights of the Egyptian people.
Jojo, what would you say to President of Egypt now if you're talking to him? What advice would you give him?
Okay, I would tell him to remove that law about letting him be the president forever, and let them vote. Let the people of Egypt vote.
So how quickly things seem to change. A lot of back and forth here. Richard, does anyone really know what's going on or what the best solution is?
The best solution for Egypt? I think it's a moving target, and there will be others who know more about that. But one of the things that strikes me about this entire discussion is the economic forces involved. Obviously, there are geopolitical interests that the United States has in the region, but Egypt has also been brought into turmoil by exactly the same kind of austerity economics being imposed prematurely on them as we're seeing being debated in this country with deficit commissions and so forth at a time of extremely high and ongoing unemployment here, just as they have extremely high and ongoing unemployment there. And we see a food price crisis over in Egypt being another factor, and there are a number of indications that bank speculation may have contributed significantly to that. So in addition to the geopolitical forces, I think there's a problem of economic philosophy and of political interest being too tied with financial interests that's also destabilizing the region over there, and any meaningful solution that lasts in the long term, I think, is going to have to address that relationship in a more healthy way.
And of course, back in 2008, it was the military that helped ease the bread crisis. Now, obviously, they're stretched very thin. But Richard, I want you to also talk a little bit more about the role of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank in all of this, particularly, as you said, Egypt easing corporate regulations and what that actually meant for a majority of the population, not just the few who were benefiting from it.
Well, what you saw over the last 6 years or so in Egypt was, with this considerable influence and pressure from World Bank and IMF and a number of other institutions, was an imposing of what's described as liberalized rules regarding the ownership of banks, of corporations. You saw a lowering over the past few years of the top income tax rate, very much like the political experiences of the last several months here in this country, a lowering of the top corporate and personal income tax rates, and pressure to reduce government spending. Now, they, in many ways, have significantly more generous subsidies, along with greater poverty, than we do here, but there's pressure not to increase the subsidies for purchasing food, even though food pricing, as I mentioned, is going way up. There are fuel prices going up. There have been subsidies for that being increased recently. But you've seen great pressure to reduce these kinds of expenditures and to impose what the Right-Wing Heritage Foundation refers to as economic freedoms on Egypt, which have not resulted in any improvement in the poverty rate or in the rate of unemployment. So again, we're seeing the same philosophy of cutting taxes, austerity economics, cutting spending, and continued high unemployment, and the public discontent that results from that.
I want to bring Robert back into the conversation and also mention that it has been confirmed that Mubarak will not run again. And Robert, you know, you've said that if it were not for all this U.S. foreign aid, largely military aid to Egypt, that this would be a whole different story altogether, that perhaps we might not even be having this conversation right now. What do you mean by that?
Well, because in the context of the last week, you have some people, of course, the protesters in Egypt have been demanding that the United States government distance itself from Mubarak, condemn Mubarak, call for Mubarak to step down, and in fact contribute to efforts to induce Mubarak to step down. And some voices in the United States have tried to say, oh, well, you know, including the Obama administration early on, well, you know, we can't intervene. You know, you see this argument like, well, we have to respect Egypt's sovereignty, you know, we can't, you know, we don't want to be in the position of pushing out the Egyptian leader. And then, of course, it's important to see that statement in the context of the last 30 years of U.S. policy. People in Egypt perceive the U.S. as having backed Mubarak with billions of dollars in aid, mainly military aid, with diplomatic and political support, including, you know, up until a week ago, the statements that you played in that little montage of Mubarak and Clinton and others. So that's the context in which it's kind of ridiculous to say that, you know, like Pontius Pilate, that the U.S. can wash its hands and say, you know, we're not going to be involved, because people, be like a dog owner saying, I'm not going to get involved with the fact that my dog is terrorizing the neighbor children. You know, people are saying, take responsibility for your dog. That's the perspective of people in Egypt as a result of the history of U.S. policy.
Now, you talk a lot about U.S. interests, Robert, and it was interesting because a Daily Telegraph article came out along with some of the things that WikiLeaks revealed that pretty much said that something like 3 years ago, the U.S. was sort of harboring some of these activists that have taken a lead role in these protests, so sort of hinting that they knew all along that this was going to happen. Why would they do that, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to sort of not get carried away by intimations or rumors that, you know, the Egyptian opposition is a sock puppet for the United States. It's been longstanding U.S. policy to try and maintain relations with everyone, which is, you know, the strategic policy that people pursue all over the world. And in fact, you know, the U.S., even when it says, you know, we're not talking to so-and-so, it turns out that they are. So, for example, you know, the U.S. is now asked, oh, are you talking to the Muslim Brotherhood? And they say no. And, you know, technically that might be true, but in fact, you know, the U.S. does talk to independent members of parliament that are supported by the Brotherhood. So they have a line of communication, as they should. And, of course, the U.S. has lines of communication to the opposition, as they should, and has, you know, done some very modest efforts to support some efforts by the Egyptian opposition. But the overall story, of course, is the one that, you know, the U.S. has been perceived as backing Mubarak and been very slow As you said, we've seen a lot of change in the last week, day by day. Every day, the U.S. shifts its rhetoric significantly from the day before. That's the overall story, is the U.S. support for Mubarak.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of back and forth, and I certainly appreciate both of you with your analysis. Robert Naiman, Policy Director at Just Foreign Policy, and Richard Eskow, Senior Fellow for the Campaign for America's Future. Thank you both so much.